Hi, this is Lorraine Watry, and I am going to be explaining how I do a soft focus background for this painting that I am going to be doing for a demonstration for a workshop coming up. And I have the painting that I did prior to this to get an idea of what colors I was going to use. This is my finished piece, as you can see. And I have a pink and yellow columbine with a soft focus background. And so I thought I would create this video so that you can see how I did that. Let me move this one out of the way. And the first thing you'll notice is that I have masked or taped my main flower and the stem and the bud that is a part of the painting. So this is a close-up of a single flower and a bloom. And then I have also used masking fluid to mask the smaller pieces of the main flower. So I put that on where it was a little thinner lines or rounder shapes. And then I used masking tape over my pencil and used an X-Acto blade to carefully go around and cut the form out of the masking tape. So my pencil line was still not extremely dark. It is viewable through the masking tape as long as you have masking tape that is a creamy color and not colored, like blue or some of the other colors they have out now. And you just take your time, and you have to make sure that your blade is sharp, and it should be a new blade. If it's not sharp, you could actually press too hard and cut through your paper and or gouge it so that the paper's either cut, or you might have a groove in the paper that the ink or paint wants to sink down into. So and for me, this works really well because now I can just focus on painting the background, and I don't have to think about carefully going around each of the parts of the main flower or the main object. So my paper is stretched, which means I did my drawing on the surface of the paper, and then I went and to the sink and I wet it on both sides. And then when your paper flops over, and it usually takes a couple minutes, 2 to 3 minutes, it is ready to staple down. So underneath the tape on the edges I have staples. And when you say stretching, that doesn't mean that you are actually pulling on your paper. So once I have wet it, I set it on my board, and then I staple it down and then tape it. And I have a video that I will try to link to this video so that you can watch how I stretch my paper if you'd like to see that. The other thing you can do, which I did not include in the stretching video, is that there's a couple other ways you can sort of stretch your paper. One is to roll masking tape and attach the tape behind your paper, and then you can attach it to the board that way. Or you can, before doing any kind of wetting of the paper, you can set it on your board, tape it down, and make sure it's at least a ½ inch in from the edge, and then wet it with a brush over the whole thing. And I would do that 2 or 3 times so that the paper really gets saturated with water, and then you have to let it dry completely for whichever form of stretching you're going to do. If you wet the paper, you want to make sure that it's completely dry, and the way you know it's completely dry is it has no temperature. It doesn't feel cool. If it's wet, it will feel a little cool to the touch. All right, so I'm going to get out my color, and because this background is a quarter sheet of paper and there's quite a bit of background, I am going to get out extra paint because I want to make sure that I don't run out in the middle of what I'm working on. So this is sap green, and I decided to use sap green for this one because it just was a nice deep green that I could add some blue to change it a little bit even darker if I wanted to, and it worked well with the other colors that I was using, the yellows and the pinks that were in there. I'm going to set this up here, and my drawing that I have on my paper has some little round circle areas, and in photography, when you're looking at a scene and you've kind of blurred the background, you might get what's called bokeh, and that's those little round circles that appear in the image because of how the lens and all of that is seeing things. So I like that in my close-up images. It just makes it interesting to me and adds to the background instead of just having it be one solid color. So those are things that would probably be flowers or maybe light catching something in the background, and so I like including that. And so I have the sap green out. I'm going to get my ultramarine deep, and I use mostly Daniel Smith paints, but my ultramarine deep is a Holbein pigment because Daniel Smith doesn't have this particular darker ultramarine. And move that. And these two colors are the ones I'm going to be needing the most of. So I'm going to really get more out. And I'm just kind of really pushing my brush around in the well to get the paint onto the brush, and sometimes it doesn't want to adhere to your palette, even if you've roughed your palette up a little bit, or if it's a palette you've used for a while. I cleaned this one just recently, just water and my towel, and so that blue is not wanting to kind of adhere to the surface and let go of the brush. So I'm just going to use the edge to kind of get it to release a little bit. So I may have to get more of this out at some point. Okay, and then I'm going to get out my pink and I believe I used 2 yellows in the original one, so I will pull 2 yellows out in case I need them. And I have both containers. I have a container for cleaning my brush. That would be the dirty water that I'm cleaning in right now. And then I have a container that I use for my clean water. So I always have both in case I need to have some clean water to use on my paper. All right, and then I'm going to get out the Quin Rose. Okay, a little more. I don't need a lot of that just because it's not going to be really large areas. And the last 2 will be the yellows. I may get out a touch more of the sap green before I start. So I'm pulling out some of Aureolin Yellow, and Aureolin Yellow is a cooler yellow. It leans a little more toward green. When you're looking at yellows, it's not as orange a yellow. And again, I won't need a lot of that. So I'm pulling that out, and then I will get out some New Gamboge, which is a warmer yellow. And it leans toward orange. Okay. And so this just gives me options. I can vary what I'm doing in the painting background with those different colors. And then just a little more sap green, and I should be ready. And it's best to, especially if you're doing a background like this, wet and wet, it's best to pull out all of your colors beforehand, because you could wet the paper, and then if you haven't pulled out your color, or if you have to take a long time getting your color out, your paper could be drying before you get a chance to even start painting, and and then you're having to stop and start, or it could affect your painting because it could cause areas to be drier than others. And so I just pull out all of my pigment first, and now I'm going in for the water, and I'm going to just apply it to the surface with this big brush and get it on as quickly as I can. And I'm going over the entire background surface, even the places that I might paint a different color than the green, because I want it all to be soft focus and not to have hard edges. And I'm just painting right over the taped and masked areas. And whenever you use masking tape, you should press it down. Just make sure after you've cut it and all of that, that you go back and just give it a little bit of pressure around all of the edges so that you can make sure that it's not going to allow any paint to seep under. And the tape that I use is Scotch Brand masking tape, and it is called Pro Painter, and it says high adhesion on the interior piece of the information, so it means it's extra sticky and will hold well. Okay, and I did go back up on the top edge just to make sure that it wasn't drying before I started. Now the first thing that I want to do is start with my little circles or bokeh areas, and right now my board is tipped. It's about 2 inches off of my art table, and so I'm using that for gravity, but I may decide that I don't want it tipped, that I want the paint to kind of stay where I'm putting it a little bit more. So for right now I'll have it up there, but then I may take it down as I'm working. Alright, I want to just make sure my brush is really clean, so I'm using my clear water. And I'm going to go into the yellow first. And you could even leave some of these areas of bokeh as whites. You wouldn't have to put color in there if you don't want to. And I like to vary the color just a little bit. And the color will move farther than where you put it depending on how wet your paper is and how wet your brush is when you go to apply the paint. Just cleaning it a little bit, and then I'm going to get some of my rose with just a touch of the yellow in it because I want to kind of neutralize it just a little bit, meaning I don't want it to be too bright a pink in the background. I want it to have a little bit of some softer or less vibrant feel to it. Okay, and I'm going to put a little bit of the pink up in here. And I have a little down at the bottom. I think I'm going to put just a touch in there. And then I'm going to go back to my Oriole and yellow, and it's already, my paper is already starting to dry just a touch at the lower side here, so I'm going to have to move kind of quick to make sure it doesn't completely dry before I want it to. Okay, so I've got those lighter, kind of brighter colors on there, and now I'm going to come back with my sap green, and I'm going to start in the corner, so I want that corner to be a little darker, so I've gone over to my ultramarine deep and put some of that in there. Now as I come down around the bokeh areas, I am going to stay back from them just a little bit because my color is going to want to move into those. It's going to keep moving inward. So if I create sort of a circle shape, it's going to want to fill it in and make that area even smaller than where I put the paint. So I want to be careful that I don't go too far, too close, because it might take out that shape completely if I go in too far. All right, and some sap green up here. And I like how the sap green is lighter in some places and darker with the ultramarine deep in others. So I'm going to just kind of keep working with that. Now I do need to pull out some more ultramarine deep. I didn't quite get out enough. So what I'm going to do is get to a place where I can pause, and I'll put a little bit of water on the paper. So I'm just kind of filling in some of these areas that act as natural breaks, and then I will bring some more water onto the paper. So this area right here, and I'm trying to stay away from the green that I just put on because I don't want it to move too much and run as I'm doing this. And I have to also be careful, those colors that I put on earlier, I might end up with a little bit of blooming happening, so I may have to come back and put some paint in those areas as well, because I am adding extra water to this area of the paper. It might push some of the colors that I've already applied around and cause blooms. Okay, so I'm going to get out as quickly as I can some more of the ultramarine deep, and even if I just have it wet and have to put my brush in there, that would be fine as well. Okay, and I'm using a separate brush for that so that I can keep going. I'm going to add a little bit of blue up in here. And I'm just going to go right in my well because at this point I need to keep moving. So most of the time I try not to go into the well directly because I like to keep my colors as bright as I can, and that can start muddying up your paint. So I'm kind of liking some of the lighter pieces right there, so I'm going to leave that. And then as I'm moving down, I will kind of see how wet this area is or not, and then make adjustments if I need to. So some of the yellow that was in right here has moved down, but some of that will disappear because I can just take my green right over it and it won't matter. And I'll come in just a little bit right there. And then I'm going to release some of the blue out of the brush. Okay. Pull up some more of the sap green. Now right now the paint on my palette is not very wet anymore, which is actually a good thing, because if the paint over here was really wet and I went to apply it where the paper is drying, it could cause blooms in my final outcome. So having the paint on my palette be just a little drier is a good thing. Now at the bottom down here, there is a big area that is a bead of water that has collected at the bottom because my palette or my board is tipped. And because of that, I will need to go in and kind of wick that up a little bit with my brush in a few seconds here. So just want to make sure I have enough value. If my background can be painted in one pass, it will be a fresher, nicer looking image or background, I should say, than if I had to come back over it. So if I can put it in and leave it alone, that is the best thing to have happen. All right, so down at the bottom, I'm drying my brush so that it's just damp, and then I can just touch and it will lift up that pigment or that little bead of water and paint, and that keeps it from pushing back later. Now there is also a little bit here on this side and some right up in here along the tape edge, so I'm just going to carefully pull that up. The one thing you need to be careful of is that you're not stroking over the surface, because then usually with a drier brush like this it will lift the pigment. So I'm not trying to pull any color out of there. And I do want to add just a touch more in a few places so that it's dark enough. I'll re-wet my pigment here so I can get a little more out. So at this point everything is kind of wet, and I have a few seconds to make some adjustments. This has started to dry because it's lost its shine, so I don't want to go up into that area, but down in this lower section I can add a little more depth by adding to it. So the one thing you just may have noticed that I did was, after I mixed the paint, because I pulled some water out and it was a little wetter, I took my paper towel and I dried the back edge of my brush, because I don't want as much moisture in the brush, and so by drying that back edge, that will keep me from putting too much water with the paint onto my paper, and keep it from causing blooms. Okay, just a touch more, so a little more blue, and I'm going to just kind of put that down in this corner. All right. All right, so I think I am done with this background, and I think it will dry with enough value, enough darkness that my flower will pop from it when I go to paint that in later. So I am going to leave it and let it dry. And if you paint a background in and you need it to be dark and it's not quite dark enough, the best thing to do if you're needing to go add some more value, but maybe it's already started to dry. This is pretty dry up here, and if I tried to go back into that, I could cause issues the whole way through. So it is better to let it dry and then re-wet the whole thing, and then adjust where you need to adjust. But yeah, in general with watercolor, if you need to make adjustments, most of the time it is better to let an area dry and then come back and re-wet and make adjustments after it has dried. So one thing I just noticed is I have a little bit of a lighter edge right there where the water moved down the paper on the side, and I don't want to leave that there because it could cause a light line right there on that side. So I'm just adding a little bit. And if the other thing you might have noticed is just dabbing color sometimes. I'm not really even stroking it on. I'm just touching and letting it come off my brush onto the paper. All right, so I think I am done with that, and hopefully that helps you understand how you can do a wet and wet background with the look of some bokeh and a little bit of variety of color, and happy painting. Thanks for joining me. Bye.